Good morning. Sounds like a fair bit of the crowd is like me. I'll confess I'm not a morning person, but Karen Gerwitz, the president, is so full of exciting optimism that when you talk to her about doing something, you can believe you can do anything, including speaking to a group before you barely finish breakfast. But I'm a couple of cups of coffee ahead of you guys, so for those of you who also aren't morning people, I'm going to ease you into this, bring you along gently. And for those of you who are morning people who've been up since like 4 o'clock in the morning making it happen, God bless you. It's not me. First, though, I want to really thank the World Trade Center. I want to thank the president, Karen Gerwitz, Dennis, who's the chairman of the Institute, Jeff Papil, the chairman of the association, who's, I believe, out doing international business someplace this morning. I don't know how many of you know, I've been involved with the World Trade Center for almost 25 years. And hopefully most people in the room know this, but many of you may not. There are actually like 319 World Trade Centers around the world. And I've had the pleasure of working with a number of them. I've visited with a number of them in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe. And I have to tell you, we are blessed here in Denver, Colorado, among other things, in that we have a World Trade Center Association that is the model, I think, for how World Trade Center should work in terms of providing real-world practical business training to help businesses do this and do it well, in terms of advocating for trade policy, and just in terms of bringing a global perspective to our business community, which I think is so critical. And so kudos to the World Trade Center, and I hope you all appreciate, as I say, how lucky we are here in Denver. So you've probably figured out by now, between the publicity for the program and the stack of things out on the table, that I recently wrote a book. By the way, so we all don't make the same mistake, the name is pronounced Maginness. It's an Irish name. I come from a long history of Irish people who don't know how to spell even our own names very well. But I'm actually not going to talk about the book this morning. When I first talked to Karen about doing this, I think it was both of our expectation that I would elucidate one of the major themes in the book. Maybe talk about how value is inherently a cultural phenomenon, and since businesses sell value, one of our biggest challenges going international is how do we translate our value proposition to a different cultural context. Or maybe about how when you're doing international business, it's not contracts that allow you to sleep at night. It's our relationships. It's knowing you're doing business with the right people. But the more Karen and I talked about it, it's been a kind of a whirlwind couple months in the world of trade policy, from steel tariffs and talk of a trade war and all the other things that are flying about. It seemed that we should address something bigger than that. And so instead of talking about the book, what I'm going to talk about this morning, really at the end of the day, is the reason I wrote the book, which is that I believe that international business is a fundamentally important thing that we do. I think it's important for economic development around the world. I think it's important, as I actually say in the book, in the conclusion, that I think international business may be the last great hope for humankind. The World Trade Center Association's general motto has always been prosperity through trade, peace through trade. And I fundamentally, after 25 years of doing this, believe that to be true. So I'll give you one disclosure of my big personal bias. I'm a private sector kind of person. And by that I mean that I think we can achieve optimum solutions, even in solving major societal problems, by bringing our personal relationships that we develop as business people and by allowing people to make free choices in open markets. Now, that's not to say, obviously, that business can solve problems without tremendous support and investment from government. But it is to say that I think it's equally foolish to suggest that government can solve major societal problems without the input and participation of the private sector. Because at the end of the day, 80% of those of us who work for a living work in the private sector. Our lives happen in the private sectors. Everything from the cars we drive and the phones we talk on and the technologies we use happen through the private sector. And so I happen to think that that's where the action is, personally. Let me ask just a show of hands. How many people here work at a company or a corporation, private business? Yeah, most of the room, most of us do. You know, I think it used to be not all that controversial to stand up in the United States and suggest that market economics was a force for good in the world. But I'm not so sure that's true anymore. And in fact, forget about free trade. I'm not sure just even domestically you can talk about market economics being a force for good and feel confident that you're going to get a warm reception. I don't know how many of you saw, Hillary Clinton did an interview just about 2 weeks ago, I think, in which she said that she felt she was hurt in the primaries by confessing that she believed in capitalism. And that's the world we live in, and it's the challenge we face. But I have to tell you, for all of the rhetoric I hear from politicians and people in government, and when I compare those with the conversations I've had and the relationships I've developed with international business people around the world after the last 25 years, it is the relationships we develop and the conversations we have as international business people that give me the hope that we can bring things together and work together for our mutual benefit instead of being torn apart for our mutual destruction. Now let me say up front, so this is not a political screed, even though Karen asked me to address what she calls the elephant in the room before we start talking about trade, which is what is going on in the world with trade policy. Nationalism, anti-globalism. And it's not partisan for this simple reason. Number one, in the United States, it's not a partisan issue. Whatever Donald Trump is doing as president, you may recall that Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders both ran on platforms calling for trade policies and sanctions against China to reel in what they felt were abuses of trade by China. They both ran on platforms suggesting we needed to renegotiate NAFTA in order to protect American jobs. They both ran against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Secondly, it's not partisan because this is hardly a uniquely American experience at the moment. This sort of anti-global nationalist rhetoric reverberates around the world, from Brexit to the recent elections in Italy and elsewhere. I'll tell you an interesting story, speaking of NAFTA. Probably one of the most vocal opponents I have spoken with in the last couple of years relative to NAFTA was not a Midwestern steel worker or car maker, but rather it was a human rights activist working on the border, our border with Mexico, to assist people who have made the difficult effort to cross our southern border. These were hardly Trump people. But interestingly, they were concerned about NAFTA and felt NAFTA was a bad idea because they felt it disadvantaged Mexico's economy relative to the United States. And they were particularly concerned about the impact that NAFTA has on Mexico's agricultural industry in the southern states of Chiapas and elsewhere as a result of American imports into Mexico of agricultural products. So, you know, there's a viewpoint we don't even think and hear about. So again, this is not a partisan issue, but I think it's something as people who do this for a living, we need to get a handle on, and we need to understand what we're talking about. So let me start first. I want to talk about what is probably the single most shining example of the positive impact that international business and global trade can have on the course of human development and human good. And that is the China miracle of the last couple decades. So the bar chart I put up here is a chart of what's happened to GDP per capita in China, essentially since the communists took power in the late 1940s. And as you can see, up through 1980, nothing is going right. We can move people into the cities, out of the cities, onto the farms. We can try all kinds of things, and life for people doesn't get any better. And then in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Deng Xiaoping decides to try an experiment. He says, you know, he starts a few experimental zones, limited areas in China, and says, let's open this up and try some market economics. Let's encourage people to engage in business. Let's have at least limited areas where we have capitalism occurring. And over the next 10 years, there's some positive signs. And so by the late 1980s and early 1990s, he decides to make it a nationwide policy in China. And China adopts capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And look what happens over the next 20 years. GDP per capita skyrockets. Talk about a hockey stick graph. And let me put a human face on this numbers for a minute. So the first time I went to China on business, I think, was 1995. So shortly after these reforms really started taking effect, the market was becoming more open. American companies, European companies were going to China looking for opportunities to do business there. And my very first trip into Shanghai, you know, Shanghai is a beautiful city, but I can tell you the streets were full of bicycles, taxi cabs, the occasional black Mercedes limousine. I went to visit a manufacturing facility in a town called Changzhou, China, which is a little bit north of Shanghai. We headed out in one of the black Mercedes limousines. It took us 4.5 hours because shortly after we cleared the nice paved streets of Shanghai, we were on a dirt road with rototillers and tractors and cows and everything else you can imagine. My most recent trip there, and I've traveled there off and on since then, Shanghai now is a city that is a gleaming economic capital of the world. I mean, it's an incredible place. The streets are clogged with Audis and Lexuses and Buicks and Toyotas and everything you see here. You know, I hate to say it's an icon of things going well, but it kind of is. There are Starbucks, as many Starbucks in Shanghai as there are here. Every other corner has one. I even walked past on one little street a store that sold nothing but Crocs shoes to make a call out for a local Colorado business that's had success in international markets. It's a very different place. I also, in between 1995 and my most recent trip, I went out to the same place in Changzhou. Next time we went out the whole way on a super highway. It was a lovely ride. But again, once we cleared Shanghai, there were like no other cars on the road, which was why it was so quick. Today, Changzhou is a stop on the high-speed train from Shanghai to Beijing. The entire trip takes about 20 minutes. So it's a very different world. And then to put that in a further context, as somebody doing business in China, of course, one of the things we were always interested in is, okay, everybody's China, China, China. There's 1.2, now 1.3 billion people there. But the question is, you know, what is the market there? How many consumers are in China? And again, when I first went to China in 1995, I mean, you know, it's hard to get exact with these numbers, but my best estimate and the guess of most people I worked with there was that the consumer economy, people who had risen to a sufficient middle-class existence to have disposable income, probably about 100 million people. So that means that there were 1.1 billion people living in poverty, and I mean like $1 a day, scrape the dirt with a stick, subsistence farming kind of poverty. Today, 23 years later, my best estimate is the consumer economy in China, people who've risen to a middle-class existence with disposable income, probably about 800 million people. Now that still means there's 500 million people in China living in abject poverty, but that means that the Chinese raised 700 million people out of abject poverty to a decent economic existence in 25 years or less. I defy you to show me any other program that's been undertaken anywhere else in the world that has that kind of positive economic impact on people's lives. And I don't think you can. So, having said that, the question then, I guess, is the Chinese miracle, are these other positive possibilities from international trade threatened by steel tariffs, threatened by a possible trade war, threatened by discussions of sanctions among and between countries? And I think in order to answer that question, we first need to be realistic about what is the environment of international trade that we operate in this era, or honestly, in any recent era. I guess I'm not using my notes from here on out. I just spilled an entire glass of water on it. So we'll see how this goes.
You're good.
Thank you. So you may notice when I talk about this subject, I generally talk about international business or maybe global trade. I almost never talk about free trade, for the simple reason that free trade is like a free lunch. It doesn't exist. It's nice to put the word into agreements that we sign because it's a great sort of theoretical, aspirational goal for people who believe in it. But it's not the world we live in. It's not the world we've ever lived in. It's not the world we're living in any time in our lifetimes. And there's a number of pretty simple, pretty good reasons for it. I mean, when we talk about free trade agreements, first of all, let me say this. For free trade to happen, you basically need a free market flow of all of the elements of production. So it's goods, it's capital, it's labor. And when we look at free trade agreements, most of the time we're focused on goods and services. And even within that, we're mostly focused on things like tariff barriers to trade or quotas imposed on quantities of goods or types of services that can be offered or sold. More recently, of course, free trade agreements, they get a little bit into trying to equalize labor conditions. They try and deal somewhat with environmental regulations and conditions. But by and large, they focus on a limited universe of things. So the point is that even within the world of goods, and even among countries that are trade allies, there are a tremendous number of restrictions that occur in the trade of goods and services. I mean, look, for example, what Europe does with GMOs. Genetically modified organisms. The European Union has very strict regulations on the ability to have GMO components in its food. Now, the European Union would argue, obviously, that this is a health and safety regulation, that this is a fundamental thing they have to do. It's not an affront to trade, it's simply protecting the health and safety of their consumers of food. But from what I read, at least, and I'm not an agronomist, but I think most science would tell us that it's honestly nothing but a trade restriction intended to protect the European agricultural industry and what it perceives as its domestic food supply from competition from the United States. But it's not an argument you're going to win anytime soon. There are also lots of things that are really trade restrictions, and we argue about them, but honestly, I'm not even sure whether they're necessarily good or bad. Take, for example, all the rhetoric and hand-wringing that happens over subsidies for businesses in China. Obviously, a lot of the products that come out of China are subsidized by the Chinese government, either directly or because simply China pumps a lot of money out of its central bank into the economy, or in some cases pretty directly because a lot of large operations in China are still fundamentally state-owned enterprises. So those companies are the state, and they're playing with state dollars, and it's a subsidized industry. So one perspective on that is that's sort of an affront to free trade. My God, these Chinese, they have a competitive advantage over us that's not fair. But having said that, if the Chinese government is willing to spend money to make their products cheaper so American consumers can have more money in their pockets at the end of the day, that's a direct transfer of wealth from the Chinese government to us. That doesn't sound so terrible to me. So I think even when we talk about free trade in goods, we need to be careful about, what's good, what's bad, who are the winners, who are the losers in this deal. And then if you look at capital as a second aspect of this, the reality is that capital isn't going to flow freely as long as we have national banks and national-based currencies and national capital controls and national monetary policy. That's the reality. And again, I'm not so sure it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, monetary policy is fundamentally critical to controlling things like inflation, to helping produce at least a domestic environment that promotes economic development, that helps promote full employment. And I think it would be difficult in my mind to manage that kind of thing on a global scale. So the reality is you're going to have less than a free market or free trade around capital. It's just the world we live in. And then lastly, you look at a free market for labor. I mean, so this quite simply at the end of the day is the immigration conundrum, that a lot of the heated rhetoric and a lot of the arguments around pulling in our view toward global markets stems from. And with all due respect to Thomas Friedman, I think here's the reality of the world we live in. The political world is flat, but the business world is round. Now, that's not something that's going to change in our lifetime. It's not a reality that's going to change in lifetimes that I can foresee coming. For the simple reason that we're going to continue to be organized politically in nation states for the foreseeable future. And as long as we're arranged politically in nation states, we're going to be parts of society that have an obligation, I think, and a responsibility to determine who gets the rights of citizenship within those nations. And so there's going to be immigration policy, and there's going to be immigration restriction. Having said that, business is always going to be looking to optimize how it distributes labor as an asset across global operations. And is going to be moved to see things move more freely than they in fact flow. And so this tension is going to exist, and the tension's not going away. Just give me 1 second here, if you don't mind, to look in the puddles. So here's the thing about immigration. I think this is very much an area where, as international business people, given our interests versus what seems to be a lot of the prevailing political pushback and rhetoric around this, to start to think outside the box. Immigration, like every other debate we face today, certainly political debates, has a problem because our rhetoric, our discussions about possible solutions or about policies, not so much solutions, policies, has become so binary. I mean, if you listen to the debate on immigration, you can have the wall or you can have open borders. You can fulfill your responsibility to protect your sovereignty, or you can go about this with some degree of human compassion. And frankly, even defining the issues in those terms closes off discussion of policy in the middle ground, because it makes everything of I'm a winner, you're a loser, you're a winner, I'm a loser, and that's not acceptable. And you know, I think this is exactly an area where when I think about it, there's a huge opportunity for private business, international business to partner. Obviously, something has to be done with government. It is political also. But to get involved and find some other solutions. And let me give you an example. So if you think about immigration and why it occurs, why it's a problem. So as I say, this is not just an issue here. Obviously, it's a huge issue in Europe. But I think in the EU and here, our immigration issues tend to stem from two different causes, and they are the two main causes of immigration anywhere in the world. So in Europe, I think it's basically based on what happens when you have civil breakdown as a result of wars and civil wars. I mean, Europe obviously is located near the Middle East, and given what's happened in the Middle East over the last 20 years, obviously Europe is experiencing that flow of immigration. Our immigration issue tends to stem principally from the other thing that tends to cause mass immigration, which is simply a disparity of economic opportunity between two adjacent countries with a crossable border. I mean, if you think about it, that's why I haven't heard a lot of rhetoric about somebody wanting to build a wall across Montana. Although I'll tell you a funny story. My wife and I were hiking in Glacier National Park last year, and we were up in Waterton Canyon Parks, which is the national park adjacent to Glacier in Canada. And you come back down through Canada, and you come back into the United States in Goat Haunt, Montana. And I'll tell you, if you look up middle of nowhere in the dictionary, there's a picture of Goat Haunt, Montana there. I mean, it's the middle of nowhere. But you get off the boat from Canada to hike into the wilderness in Goat Haunt, Montana, and you have to cross a U.S. Customs enforcement facility and show your passport. It's kind of hilarious. That'd be a great job if you want to go to Border Patrol. You get to spend your summer in a cabin on the Canadian border. But anyway, if you look at our southern border, which is where the issue for us that produces the rhetoric tends to arise, there's something here, honestly, I've never heard discussed. I've certainly never heard one of our political leaders talk about it. And it's simply this. What would happen if instead of spending all of our time with rhetoric around either on the one hand building a wall or on the other hand showing a little human decency to people who have made what I can tell you is a pretty difficult journey across the border, if we started focusing on what would it take to facilitate sufficient economic development in Mexico to take its economy to the next level so that just as many people would want to immigrate from here to Mexico as go the other way. And I think it's a doable thing. I mean, Mexico is a terrific place. The Consul of Mexico is sitting here next to me, and I've done a lot of business in Mexico. In fact, my first international job was running a business in Mexico. And it's a wonderful market. It's a terrific place. You know, we should do more with each other. But I don't hear that discussion happening. But it's the kind of discussion, exactly the kind of discussion, since politicians aren't talking about it, that international business people ought to be driving. How do we look at how we build our enterprises and develop our business in a way that that kind of economic development becomes the focus of our policy? Because anything we do at the border, let's face it, is a short-term fix for a symptom. It doesn't get at the root cause of the issue. So let's address the root cause for a change. So how did we get here? How did we get to this state where this thing, international business, which can be such a force frankly, for good in the world, is under siege. And I think it comes down to one simple, big reason, which is somewhere over the last number of years, maybe longer than that, business has become focused on privatizing profits while socializing costs. And I think it's that disconnect which has put us in a position where we experience so much pushback against global trade, against international business, against market economics in general as a force for good. You know, in a sense, I think it's the opposition between privatized profits and socialized costs which drives a lot of our seemingly unsolvable problems. I think it's the reason for dysfunction in health insurance markets, frankly. But it is most certainly the reason for the disconnect in rhetoric between what we as international business people believe, experience, advocate for in terms of free trade in global markets versus what happens with government policy. And here's the thing, the more governments are influenced by anti-trade rhetoric, the more trade policy is going to go in one direction. And two things are going to happen. One is the government is going to look for more ways to shift where that socialized cost goes. And more frightening to me as somebody who, as I said, is a private sector kind of guy, is they're going to start looking for ways to socialize the profits. And I personally find that to be a frightening alternative. But as private business people, I think we have an opportunity, a window of opportunity to change that by taking ownership of some of these issues ourselves. And by figuring out in the way we run and structure our businesses, how do we take ownership of the costs we create instead of simply shifting them back to the public sector? And so to do that, I mean, first off, one of the things we have to acknowledge is that globalization doesn't produce all winners and no losers. I think in the aggregate it's a good thing, but it's not a certain thing. So I think there's two things we need to do as international business people, and one of them we're very good at, and one of them we're not so good at. So let's start with the thing we're not so good at. And that's simply to acknowledge that there is real displacement from globalization of markets. It happens. Now, you know, every economist I know, myself included, would tell you that free trade, international trade, is a force for good in the aggregate, that David Ricardo's law of comparative advantage gets proved out year after year after year. But that fact is of little solace to the individual who has lost their job, or the community who has lost a major industry, as our economy moves from a domestically focused, industrial-based economy to a globally focused, information-based economy. And, you know, there's also no question in my mind that most unemployment that occurs in today's economy is a result of technology, it's a result of innovation. But it would be naive to think that none of it occurs because of globalization. So let's acknowledge that. Let's take ownership of that. As we make decisions that optimize how we move labor around the world as one of our assets as business people, let's take ownership of those costs rather than shifting the costs of that back onto the less effective and already frayed public safety net. So that's one thing. The last thing, and this is where I'll leave you. So this is the thing I think we're good at, thank God. Anyone who does international business, again, it's about relationships. I mean, business generally is about relationships, but it's even more fundamentally important when you're doing business internationally, half a world away. It's knowing you're doing business with the right people, and this is true of your customers, it's true of your suppliers, it's true of your distribution partners. You need to be working with good people. You need to be able to develop relationships with them based on mutual trust and understanding. You know, I always say one of the things I loved most about doing international business travel, and I did a lot of it over the years, is, you know, when you travel as a tourist, which is wonderful, but, you know, you go to museums and art galleries and see monuments and all those kinds of things. But, you know, when you travel as a business person, you go to the plant where people make stuff, where people work for a living. You go to their offices, where people spend most of their day getting things done, and you do enough of it, and you get lucky enough to get invited home to have dinner with their family. And it's in having those conversations and developing those kind of relationships that I think our future peace and prosperity ultimately lay. It is, frankly, my experience traveling around making those relationships in international business that I say sometimes it makes me pessimistic about government, but it makes me optimistic about the future of the human race. Because when all is said and done, it is our relationships as international business people that whatever heated rhetoric gets thrown around by governments and politicians, whether about trade wars or real wars, it is these relationships we make as international business people and the ties we create that will make those alternatives ultimately impractical, so that we can live in a world that is safe and secure for ourselves, for future generations, and we can continue to do things like raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty by doing what we do so well. Thanks. Sure. I spilled it.
No problem. All right, we have time for a question or two to keep us on schedule. Any questions for Craig this morning? Wave, don't be bashful. We're here to have a conversation. Any questions? Someone brave, throw up a hand. Here we go, right in the middle. We're coming with a mic. Hold on, we're recording it.
So if, regarding your idea of investment towards Mexico rather than like building a wall and stuff like that, what sort of business investments would you like to see in Mexico to help that state develop and be a stronger nation to our south?
Well, as I said, I mean, I think Mexico is a terrific market. It's a tremendous country to do business in. And I don't see personally any reason structurally, geographically, or honestly politically why over time our border with Mexico can't look just like our border with Canada. And if you look at how businesses are structured across our Canadian border, both Canadian businesses doing business here, American businesses doing business there, how production works, so it's about, not just looking at, for example, Mexico as a borderland to put maquiladora-like plants, but, as a partner. And so I think we have responsibilities as international business people to think about it from a positive investment point of view. One other thing I'll say about Mexico, by the way, is, a lot of people I talk to, China, 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 we're all China crazy. I mean, how can you not be given what's happened in China? But the reality is China is a tough market in lots of ways. In many ways, Mexico has a lot of similar opportunities, and American businesses, for some reason, ignore it when it's in fact would be a better place to invest in a lot of ways. So, so that's sort of our responsibility. And then I guess the other piece I'm saying is, wouldn't it be great if instead of having a struggle between business and governments, our politicians got with the program and began thinking about it that way also? And I'm talking about politicians on all sides of the aisle. As I say, this is not a political screed. I think everybody's got this problem.
Is there another question out there for Craig this morning? I have one here and then maybe one there as well.
Yeah, thank you. Just about immigration, probably you remember when we started negotiating 25 years ago, the motto in Mexico was, we want to export goods, not people. And actually, it has happened because the immigration rate to the United States has lower, and most of the people that are, I'm not saying that there's no Mexican immigration, of course there is, because there is jobs here also. And you mentioned the asymmetry of our economies. But also, is other people from other countries that are coming also through the border. It's not only Mexicans, but actually the number of Mexicans have been reduced because of the jobs created derived from NAFTA and trade and investments. And so we have made changes. We have modernized our economy also, not as big as China, of course, but that's thanks to trade and investments from foreign countries. Thank you.
Sure. No, and I couldn't agree. That's our consul from Mexico, by the way. I couldn't agree more, and I'm a huge proponent of NAFTA. And actually, I said my first international assignment was managing a business in Mexico City with a plant in Tampico and Tamaulipas. And I have seen from when I first started doing that in 1993 through today exactly the development in Mexico, and it's been huge, it's tremendous, and extremely positive. And I also certainly agree with you that, yes, when I talk about sort of adjacent countries, that includes people who can transverse across a country. So, of course, it's Honduras and Guatemala and other places as well. But, yeah, I'm a huge believer in what we've accomplished so far, and I think a lot more could be done with a lot more positive spin on what our challenge is.
We have time for one final question for Craig. Did I see one in the middle here? Do you still have a question? Go ahead and throw it. All right, there we go. Right there.
I was just curious about what your perspective is and kind of investments across the African continent, because every time I'm from Ghana, and in Africa we have 54 countries. And what I've had in the past 5 years that I've been in the United States is that most companies talk about China, mostly Latin America and all other areas. I hardly hear people talk about Africa. Even though there's some minor investments with companies, I work for Aero Electronics, and when I look at our revenue quarter by quarter, I see that most of our billions that we make is from outside the United States. Increasingly, the North American market is becoming saturated, and for you to be able to compete and be successful, you have to push out a lot of cash. So what is your perspective of a new trajectory into the African continent, and what is the US government doing to ensure that there's that kind of economic boost for people to come out of poverty?
It's a great question, because obviously Africa is, a huge market in addition to anything else. In terms of U.S. government policy, I'm not an expert on U.S. government policy. As I said, I'm a business person. So somebody else could address that better. But I'll give you my couple thoughts on Africa, why it's, I think, been more challenging than China, for example. I mean, one is China obviously has the advantage with its 1.3 billion people of at least being a single government and can establish a government policy on its own as to what to do, what direction to go, how to facilitate trade from its point of view. Africa, because it is so many different countries and political systems and even cultural differences from country to country, makes that more challenging. I have certainly been to presentations which takes the position that, Africa is the next China in terms of a market, but everything I see seems to be years out. And now, having said that, I think if you look at Africa in particular countries, some countries are very, I think, open to good trade relations, others less so in terms of their attitude toward economics. I did some work a couple years ago in Kenya with the Coca-Cola Company, which has a tremendous operation in Africa, and I think could be a model of how companies approach Africa as a matter of investment. But I guess the bottom line, to cut to the chase, is your question is absolutely right and really raises a significant issue. One other observation on Africa, a few years ago, I guess it was about 10 years ago now, one of the rounds of the international trade negotiations held in Doha was supposed to be focused entirely on how do the developed countries address development in Africa. And as much as people went into it with good intentions, the entire thing fell apart really over a single issue, which is if you look at comparative advantage, one of the principal places that a lot of African countries could first get their foot into international trade is in agricultural trade, because that's where they frequently have a comparative advantage. If you look at like the flour industry coming out of Kenya, for example. And yet, agriculture is one of the principal areas where people protect their domestic economy. They just see their food chain as a strategic asset. And it fell apart entirely because of both the United States and Europe trying to protect their domestic agricultural industries and therefore not permit that sort of genesis of vibrant global trade that could have happened. So, it's a huge challenge. And I think you're absolutely right. It's one that, and I take ownership and apologize as well, it's something we don't spend enough time thinking about, talking about, or trying to address, and we should. So thank you for that.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a big round of applause for Mr. Craig Maginness?
Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, sir.
Appreciate it.
Apologies for making me sound more Nordic than Irish.
Tenor and the board and the members, I want to thank you so much for your wonderful remarks today, and welcomed, and thank you all again. Give them a round of applause again. Would you?